And we are live on the Juice Business Podcast. Today we have the infamous Joyce Longfield. Hi, Joyce.
Hi, Charlie.
Thanks for coming all the way to Buffalo to do this.
Thanks for inviting me.
It's not usually easy to get people to come to Buffalo, so.
It's lucky that I live somewhat close.
Right.
Yeah.
So you live in Chicago?
Chicago, but split my time with Toronto.
Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just flew direct from Chicago?
Well, I was in Toronto for the weekend, so then just drove down.
Oh, yeah, you drove down. I knew that. I forgot. Okay, cool. We have lots to talk about. We've talked about a lot since you've been in town already.
Yep.
But let's just go through it all again, I guess. So for people listening, like super basic HPP 101, what is it? Why do people use it? Where did it come from?
Sure. So the technology is over 100 years old, and it literally was invented to be an alternative to pasteurization. So instead of heating your beverages to kill the bacteria, they applied using pressure to kill the bacteria. So essentially just heat, instead you have pressure. Very simple from that perspective. As the technology evolved, what they found was the medium that you use to create that pressure can be used for different types of products and stuff. So there's even more industrial applications using pressure with like oil as a medium that's like just more for industrial and not food related. But for food specifically, water makes the most sense, right? You know, water is clean. You can monitor the temperature. So most food manufacturers will obviously use a cold temperature. So being able to use cold water pressure is just a very natural, clean method, right? You know, and there's no chemicals that are involved with that. And so essentially all you're doing is then putting finished packaged food or beverage into a chamber, which is going to fill with cold water. And then once that chamber is completely full, the pumps on an HPP machine will force about 15% more water into the chamber. And so that might not sound like a big deal to people who don't really understand the physics of water, but water is virtually incompressible.
Right,
And
so it's literally compressing the water
literally
to fit more water
compressing
in
the
the chamber.
Yeah, exactly. But if anybody who scuba dives, you know, they understand that as you go down to the depths of the ocean, pressure builds in that respect as well.
Right.
And we all know that, you know, when you're coming up to the surface, you have to come up slowly in order to equilibrate, right? Because if you come up too fast, most people will pass out and, you know, God forbid, something worse could potentially happen. So the maximum pressure that builds in one of these chambers is 6 times the deepest part of the ocean. It's 6 times more pressure than Mariana's Trench. So it's a significant amount of pressure that really single-celled organisms like bacteria and yeast, they just can't tolerate that type of intensity. And you build that pressure, you hold it for a determined amount of time based on micro studies. And then the decompression is 15 seconds. So you can just imagine like being ripped from, you know, 87,000 pounds of pressure back up to 0 atmospheric pressure in 15 seconds. So a lot of times people think that bacteria would explode, right? This single-celled organism. But if anything, what ends up happening is they more implode. So that membrane that keeps the cell stable, it's like holes get poked into it and basically the cell just collapses in. So it's, and that's mainly because the pressure is all uniform. It's all happening on the same sides all at the same time. So maybe a better visual would be like a grape. If you took a grape and put it into the HPP chamber, the grape isn't going to explode or anything like that because the pressure is all uniform.
It's not holding one directional.
Yeah, exactly. So it'd be different if it was like on this table and I pushed my thumb on it. That's one direction pressure. So really the cells of the grape just start to kind of collapse and become softer. So that's why the grape itself still comes out looking like a grape. It's just a lot more tender to the touch because the skin cells and everything have been like just sort of compromised, I guess.
So it kind of makes sense. I can imagine kind of squeezing it really hard, then letting it go, and it's just kind of...
Yeah. Or putting it in the freezer is probably the best parallel. So if you put your fruit in the freezer and then you take it out, it's kind of weepy.
Right.
You know, it's because the cell structure has been compromised.
Okay. Interesting. So what kinds of organisms does HPP kill?
So I mean, really, it can kill not just single-celled organisms, so not just bacteria and yeast, but it can do multicellular, so parasites. Now, where it's challenged by is anything that forms a spore state. So, some bacteria will always be in a vegetative state, and some will take on a spore-forming state, and that's just because of environmental conditions, right? So, certain pathogens like Clostridium, they tend to survive in our environment in a spore state because they're an anaerobic organism. So they don't want to be exposed to oxygen, right? So they live in the dirt as a spore, and then they only germinate under the right conditions. So anything that has that protective barrier that a spore creates, HPP isn't really effective against it, unless you do a combination of like pressure and heat, which there's a lot of research on that, but there's not really a commercial machine
Mm,
that's been developed yet to create that type of, what they call it is high pressure thermal sterilization. So
okay.
it's possible, but it's just not commercially there.
So one of the questions we get is, since HPP is processing the food, isn't it killing all the nutrients?
So the thing with pressure, because it's not heat, as long as it's cold pressure, right? Obviously, if you were using warm water, like that is more in line with that thermal
Hmm.
sterilization. So it's different. But if it's cold water, you're not applying thermal heat. You apply what's called, or what gets applied is adiabatic heat.
Adiabatic, right?
So it is different. It doesn't denature things like proteins in the traditional sense. So if you remember back to your days of biology, proteins start as a primary structure, which is
Right.
just like a string of amino acids, and then they fold, end up making like a tertiary structure, right? And that's typically held together by strong bonds and weak bonds. And so what we know is that under 87,000 pressure, strong bonds are very stable. Weak bonds can be compromised. And so which way they go is very difficult to predict,
Mm,
because if I'm in an environment that is one pH versus if I have that exact same recipe in an environment that's a different pH, the bonds could be affected completely differently by the
okay.
pressure. So it's really hard to predict which way. All we know is that in most cases, just from some of the key, like take enzymes, for example, some of the key enzymes that the food industry is interested in, typically browning enzymes, right? Those are some of the most common researched enzymes. When they look at the relationship between pressure and those browning enzymes for shelf life purposes,
Hmm.
the there's usually two main enzymes that cause browning, and one of them is not affected by pressure at all, and the other one is affected by about 50% of its
Mm,
activity. So then when we talk more generically across the board about like enzymes in general, it's so hard to say specifically what is happening in that product, because again, if you make that exact same product but a different pH, you could have a completely different type of enzymatic outcome, right? So everything really needs to be brought in-house and determined like by the manufacturer of that product. What is that sensory shelf life look like based off of the enzyme breakdown? We know that there will be enzymes retained. We just don't know how long their kinetics will last under
mm.
refrigeration. They will break down eventually. It's just a matter of time.
So sensory shelf life. Let's talk a little bit about sensory versus what are the different kinds of shelf life.
Sure. So traditionally, most people think when they think shelf life, they think of bacteria, right? So, the microorganisms like on that product, and when will mold start to grow or something like that, right? But with HPP, because 90% of the food is or beverage is refrigerated, it's very rare that you will use HPP to create a shelf stable product. It's not that you can't, but it's just not common. So, because it's addressing the bacteria to get it down to a safe level and then you're refrigerating it, it's not often that you have a product that spoils microbially after it's been treated by HPP. It spoils sensory wise. So, how it spoils kind of goes back to what we were discussing with enzymes and raw ingredients. If you are using 100% raw ingredients, like in the case of juices,
Hmm.
then typically you will have a shorter shelf life because you're going to have that enzymatic breakdown happen. Whereas, like, let's say that I'm a ready to eat salad and I have a mixture of like cooked components and a mixture of raw components. that probably has a longer shelf life than a juice because there's not so many like live enzymes still that are going to break down that product.
Right.
So again, everything comes back to like the best advice I always give companies is just do your own sensory testing in-house. Nobody is going to know that product better than you do. So you determine, okay, when doesn't this taste good anymore?
Or when does it turn brown, right? Or
Yep.
when does it separate? Or
Little details, like especially if you are a packaged food, and if you're something that's known to turn brown, like guacamole, then you want to make sure you have the right packaging because you don't want it to start to turn brown in the package. Sure, of course, it's unavoidable that once you open it, it will
Mhm.
turn brown. And that's kind of one of the pieces of evidence that we know that HPP doesn't destroy enzymes to the way that sometimes we all think it could,
Mhm.
but that guacamole will still brown once it's exposed to oxygen.
Yeah, I have found some scientific research online showing that indeed HPP didn't affect some enzymes much at all. Like it's affected some more than others, but it seems like all the research out there is done immediately after the processing. Is there any research out there that's done, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks down the road?
During shelf life.
Yeah.
It's hard, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges with publications in general is that, like, you kind of have to understand where the group that's doing the research is coming from, where the
Right.
interest lies, and where the
For
funding
sure.
is gonna
That
be.
matters a lot.
It matters a lot.
Hmm.
So I would say that you kind of have to take publications with a grain of salt. And it really, if you want to compare what the technology is doing for the benefit of your product, you should take your product and then have it go through the HPP process and then put it through whatever the alternative process is. So if you're a juice, either you're going to flash pasteurize it or you're going to hot fill it. So depending on what one you would want to compare it to, have a lab perform the analysis on your recipe to basically showcase like if we weren't using HPP and we put it through this alternative process, this would be the result that we get. That's the best evidence that you can have because otherwise with publications, like it's just too
Right.
challenging to replicate exactly what you might be doing.
Yeah. Like you said, again, it probably all depend on the recipe and the acidity and
The conditions that it's made in, a lot of times, like in those publications, they're not giving the details. Did they make the juice, in a room that was also refrigerated? Was it, at ambient conditions? What type of juicing equipment did they
right, the
use?
process it was
The
actually made with.
process, yeah.
Yeah.
So all like there's just so many variables, so it's really hard to say in a very finite way that this is exactly what HPP does for this enzyme or this protein or whatever it
Hmm.
might be.
So if we wanted to set up some studies to actually study um, the different types, so HPP, pasteurization, and raw,
Mhm.
um, how do you think you could go about doing that in kind of a scientific way
Mhm.
that's unbiased, just looking at the actual data?
So one company that I helped organize their study, the lab, they had pasteurization technology. So basically, the juice manufacturer had made the juice, let's say on day one in their facility, sent it to the lab, and they sent enough so that they had completely untreated raw control. And then that lab, on the day that they received it, would put the product through HPP under the conditions that they use. And then they would put it through their flash pasteurization under industry standards. So let's
Mm.
say 90 degrees for 18 seconds or something like that.
Hmm.
So, and then that way that's the best you can do in terms of control because you've actually had the company make it themselves. You haven't had somebody else like the lab
Right.
say make it. So you've shipped all of the juices up at the same time. So they've all been exposed to the same temperature during the
Hmm.
shipping when they've gotten to the lab. The lab has retained the raw samples. So there's the least risk to some kind of like neglect or bias being influenced in there since it's now in a third party's hands and
Right.
they're controlling each of the samples.
Yeah. Cool. So are there labs that have HPP and pasteurization?
I wouldn't necessarily say that they might have both, but they could have access to like a tooling facility close
Right.
by or
Okay.
something, which could reflect similarly what
what
the
a juice
juice
company would go through. Right.
exactly.
When it's commercially available.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is there any data out there about nutrient breakdown over time that you know of?
So definitely and typically there you'll see more shelf life study analysis, like looking at those key components. The most common one is probably vitamin C. That's typically the one that's looked at a lot. And then probably like vitamin A, beta carotenes, they seem to be, and lycopene. I feel like those are kind of the ones that you see the most common in terms of studies. The thing with those is that vitamin C is such a volatile compound that it really doesn't matter if it's pressure, heat, light, oxygen. Like it's just such a sensitive compound. So it's not necessarily the best target indicator of what, say, a technology like HPP is doing. So I would say to look at other compounds like the beta carotene and vitamin A and lycopene because they can tend to sort of be stable longer, especially if you want to go out over shelf life. So that type of result is easier to repeat. Whereas something like vitamin C, because it's so volatile, you might not get really good repetitive data. And that's a big part of like when you're looking at research papers as well, is what is their statistical variance? A lot of times, has that been written into the paper? Has it not been? We tend to read data just for what it is and then not think about the argument. Like, well, how did they perform this study?
Right.
How many replicates did they do? How many different ways did they make those replicates? So
I've been reading a couple books about how big food and beverage has influenced researchers and scientific studies and everything.
mhm.
And one of the big problems is that a company like Coke will put out a notice and say, we're willing to pay up to $30,000 for a study that shows
Yeah,
that maybe lack of exercise causes obesity and not
sugar.
sugar. So then all these researchers out there know that they only get paid if they provide data that shows that's in line with what they want to
Right.
say.
For sure.
And that's probably the most blatant way that they do it, but also even just funding research at all, the researchers are going to subconsciously want to give data that supports where the funding's coming from,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is a big problem.
It is a big problem for sure, and because it's hard to get funding in like academia, and so you have to be able to show some kind of value to the work that you're doing. It's different, I guess, if you're getting like independent funding from your school, like just as a part of your master's or PhD or that kind of thing. But then it's also like that person really needs to kind of do their homework as to what makes sense from a commercial application side of it. And that's why I think historically we've just see a lot of publications out there that don't make a lot of sense on the commercial side of things. I definitely see that a lot, like with HPP studies specifically, where they will use conditions that nobody
Right.
would ever use, like 20-minute hold times. And nobody's ever going to do that in the industry because it would cost way too much money.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What is a general hold time?
I would say average is 3 minutes.
Okay.
And anytime you get 4 or 5 minutes, it's pricey. It gets expensive. It reduces your throughput, right? So
Oh, right. Because the longer it's in there, the longer you have to wait to send the next batch through.
Yep.
Oh,
Yeah.
it makes sense.
Yeah.
So would a tolling facility charge you more then if you're holding it longer?
People are different. I would say most of them would probably have like a base rate on a per pound cost. And that's with the understanding that it would be 3 minutes whole time or less, I guess. And then if it was additional minutes, they would probably want more money for it.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. Just kind of what are generic things you have to look out for that a tolling facility is caring for your product in the right way, and giving you like the end product you need.
Yeah. So there's a lot more accessibility to tolling facilities now than there was even 5 years ago, especially if you're on the coast. So most people are going to shop around by price first. But really, with this type of product, I kind of feel like customer service should outweigh price a lot of times. So, especially if they can offer you any type of value-added incentives, will they, keep your product after, repack it, allow it to be distributed from there? That's just a lot easier than you having to go back and pick it up.
Of course.
Right? So that's, one plus. But then even when the product gets there, historically, I think a lot of companies felt so grateful for the fact that a tolling facility was going to take them on and process their product. They didn't necessarily think to ask a lot of little details, and they just probably assumed that the tolling facility knew best, had best practices as to when to run their product. And then I can't tell you the number of times over the years I've had people randomly contact me and say, like, all of a sudden I'm getting product that's spoiling and I don't understand why. And it could be part of the reason is, did they ever have a conversation up front to ask the facility, how long after my product gets to your doorstep does it get HPP treated? Is it sitting there in the fridge for 12 hours, 24, 36, 48? Like that makes a big
that's
difference.
crazy because 48 hours raw juice is already going to reach that sensory shelf life limit, right? Going to start browning and separating
and also lactic acid bacteria is a big problem. Like while it's a wonderful probiotic that we love to take in certain ways in the food industry, it's a huge spoilage concern. And lactic acid bacteria as a byproduct produces lactic acid, which tastes sour. And so if you have X amount of let's say you have 1,000 cells of lactic acid bacteria starting in your product when you drop it off at the HPP facility. Well, we all know how bacteria multiplies exponentially. So if it sits there for 12 hours versus 48, that's a lot more lactic acid bacteria producing lactic acid that's not going to be good for the taste of your product.
So where would lactic acid come from in a raw juice?
Just naturally occurring. It's abundant on all of the raw materials, right? Especially anything more from the garden, like from the ground. It's highly abundant and it's, it's on us. It's everywhere, right? It's just so ubiquitous. So it's kind of unavoidable. The best thing you can do is keep the counts as low as possible going into the bottle. So even if you're not using HPP, what does your GMPs look like in your facility, like upstream of bottling?
So what is GMP?
Good manufacturing practices.
Okay.
Yeah. So what do you do in your facility for sanitation? What's your cleaning? Like, what are your environmental programs like and stuff?
Right. Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit as far as food safety is concerned. There was the big E. coli scare in 1996 with Odwalla, and they traced that back to kind of using bad apples that were
falling on the ground.
Yeah, and had like animal feces on them or something. And then even when they came into the factory, there's an employee there that said, I think we should reject these because they look too rotten, but used them anyway.
Yep.
Ended up getting a bunch of people sick. And then the government came in and made a law now that that was crazy. A law that you have to achieve a 5-log kill in order to sell juice wholesale. So using pasteurization or HPP. Probably UV. Yeah, HPP wasn't even around then, right? In the 90s?
I mean, the technology was there, but it's just way too expensive to use compared to today.
Right, okay. So do you think that raw juice itself is inherently dangerous, or could it be done in a safe way if it's distributed like locally? Or should all juice, in your opinion, be achieve that 5-log kill before getting distributed?
So, I mean, I don't see how juice is any more higher risk than any other type of raw produce that's going to the grocery store. Part of the reason why these laws get put in place is when they look at the big picture, right? So how many people now is this juice product reaching versus if it was just made in a little retail store? Also, where is it going? Because we know that temperature abuse is a huge problem in the industry.
Right.
So temperature can be definitely much more controlled at a store level. And so then with that, with all the other good manufacturing practices, sanitation, your environmental program, you can make a safe juice in your facility, especially if you're going to acidify it. But when it starts to go through the distribution channels, that's when regulatory bodies get nervous, especially if they're in a state that's just known for temperature abuse, right? In the southern states. So, sure, it does come from fear, but it comes from fear for a good reason because we don't have a perfect system in terms of distribution and maintaining temperature. Not everybody can afford to put temperature trackers in their cases and know for a fact that when it got to the doorstep, it maintained this
Of
temperature
course.
the whole
Right.
time.
So you're working on something called the Juice Task Force, right?
Mhm.
Can you explain what that is?
So the Juice Task Force was formed about 2 years ago, and it's in conjunction with the Institute of Food Safety and Health out of Illinois, which is IFISH for short. And so that location in Bedford, Illinois, is also the offices for that the FDA work out of. So we, just work closely with the FDA and in discussions with them. They were equally as frustrated in the fact that they would hear from juice companies when juice companies would contact iFish and they would say things like, "Well, my inspector's telling me I need to do this, and is this right?" and stuff. So there wasn't a lot of consistency that was going on in the US in terms of the message that
Hmm.
should be passed down and what should be asked of these companies. So that is frustrating to the FDA because a lot of times then regulatory bodies at the local, Department of Agriculture are interpreting things their own way and might not be asking for things that are accurate or fair compared to what a different inspector in a different state would ask, which is part of the reason why you saw for a time there, nut milks were allowed to be made in this state, but not in this state, and
Right.
this kind of thing, because it was just inconsistent. So we realized that we needed the task force to start to create like a standard protocol that inspectors would be equipped with to go in and ask the right questions. So that was one part of it. But then the other part of it was to your point that you had made earlier with the story about the E. coli. When that happened, it was just all of a sudden like, okay, the only solution is just a 5 log reduction,
Right.
right? So that basically meant that looking at from a pH perspective, 4.6 is a safety pH because of Clostridium, which is that spore-forming organism. So when they wrote Juice HACCP, it was kind of like everything has to be south of 4.6 and everything has to have some kind of 5 log treatment to it. So it was just very black or white. And there wasn't any type of room for saying, well, should everything be thrown under that umbrella? Like, so with the task force, we're kind of taking an approach of like a risk assessment, a decision tree. Should every product be treated the same? Well, the fact of it is that it shouldn't, because different recipes are less risk than other recipes. And then to that point, different production facilities could be less risk.
Of
Like
course.
you could have like,
You and I have both seen some bad ones that are
yeah,
tasty
you,
and good ones and really
you
good
could
ones. Yeah.
have basic like bare bones, making it in an approved kitchen, like with no environmental program and no sanitation program or anything like that. But then you can have the opposite end of the spectrum where it's fully refrigerated, from start to finish. There's environmentals that are checked for. So it shouldn't be that everybody is thrown into the same basket, and it shouldn't be that every recipe is thrown into the same basket. And so that's one of the big pieces that the task force is working on is that decision tree. And then the other piece is we have had funding from the USDA for a grant to work towards a safe harbor for HPP. So coming up with what is that pressure and hold time, say for like a single strength juice or maybe a blended juice to deliver that 5 log reduction. And that will definitely help all these juice companies not have to pay for a validation study every single time. So
Hmm.
kind of working on 3 things right now.
So right now, a company, if they're going through HACCP and they're going to be wholesaling in the HPP, what kind of validation process do they have to go through?
So they have to do some kind of testing to demonstrate that it is achieving that 5 log reduction of the pathogen of concern for their product. So if you look through Juice HACCP, it'll historically tell you, well, salmonella is associated with citrus, E. coli is associated with apple juice. And so depending on if there were any other known breakouts, right? So like if some other type of orchard fruit had a recall with a particular pathogen, then that could potentially be linked to, what your pertinent pathogen of concern is. Listeria always seems to be kind of the default organism. If there isn't something that specifically says this is your pathogen of concern or that one is. Listeria tends to be the default one because it's also a very ubiquitous organism. It falls into like a similar family like the lactic acid producing bacteria, except Listeria monocytogenes is pathogenic, right? So with that being said, most times juice companies have to include that as one of their pertinent pathogens of concern,
Mm.
just because you kind of can't get away from it.
I've heard it does kind of just exist in some facilities, right? It's
It
just there.
does. It
Yeah.
does, and it's really hard to get out. It's like, that organism could live on this table,
Right.
So it is really, really difficult to get out of your facility.
So then they figure as long as you're achieving a 5 log reduction, you're at least protecting against Listeria and E. coli and everything else.
Yeah, and in terms of pressure, specifically, if you remember your days of biology when you used to do those gram stainings and you used to have like gram positive and gram negative, and one was purple and one was pink, and that's because bacteria in their membrane, they have something called peptidoglycan, and it's basically like what sort of keeps their matrix together. So gram positive bacteria have a much more tighter, thicker matrix, right? They have more peptidoglycan than gram negative bacteria. Lactic acid bacteria, Listeria, they're gram positive. Salmonella, E. coli is gram negative. So one of the rationales is that if your HPP treatment is effective against Listeria monocytogenes, most likely would also be able to deliver a 5 log reduction of Salmonella and E. coli because they tend to be more pressure sensitive.
Okay.
But that's not always the case. Like with pasteurization, there's some Salmonella species that are highly heat tolerant. So you can't just kind of use that principle for every technology. And even for UV, the interesting thing about UV is that it's also not necessarily based off of the type of bacteria as well. It even comes down to the recipe. So while you might be able to deliver a 5 log reduction in this recipe, for a carrot juice with UV, you might not be able to deliver the same 5 log reduction for those organisms under the exact same UV conditions
Right.
for a green juice.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just because of the components that's going on in the recipe.
Right. And I have heard there's a challenge of using UV for some small companies is having to go through all the same kind of validation studies and everything.
For sure. And so we going back to the vitamin C story, we love it. We want it in our juice. Vitamin C absorbs UV wavelengths. And so if it's absorbing part of the wavelengths, then that is less effective than to kill the bacteria.
Of course.
So, an amazing orange juice or apple or pineapple juice that could be high in vitamin C might not be so great for that technology.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So how warm? Sorry, I know I'm jumping around here, but how warm does the juice get through adiabatic heating while it's going through the process?
So 87,000 pounds of pressure is equal to 600 megapascals. For every 100 megapascal, it increases 3 degrees Celsius. So 3 times 6 is 18. So typically under cold water treatments, the highest adiabatic temperature exposure it would reach is, let's say, just 18 to 20 degrees Celsius potentially. So even that is nothing.
So 18 degrees higher than when it went in there, you mean?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
So as long as it's going in, what temperatures do they normally send it in at? Like 41 or something?
I would say on average, like most manufacturing facilities that are making some kind of ready to eat, ready to drink food, whether they have HPP in-house or not, their production rooms are typically, I would say the goal of them is probably 41 degrees. Temperature isn't something that the FDA has like a very finite number in place. So it's not that you couldn't manufacture under, let's say, 50 or 55 degrees. As long as you validated that whatever temperature you were operating under, you were still maintaining a good environmental program to not, encourage growth and stuff. Like if they come in and do swabs of your environment and find some serious problems, one of the recommendations they might say is you need to change the temperature of this room.
Interesting. All right. So if I were a juice company just exploring HPP and looking at, I guess normally you probably don't have many options, right, for tolling facilities in your area. depending on where you're located.
depending on where you're located.
Hmm.
Yeah. If you're on the coast, a lot more options than kind of central US.
Right. Um, so if I were going to a tolling facility, would I still have to go through the validation studies as if I had the HPP equipment myself?
So yes, would be the answer to that. And the way that it's looked at is, so in juice HACCP, I am the manufacturer of that product. So I am responsible to ensure that the product delivers a 5 log reduction.
Hmm.
Let's just say if that's the path I've chosen. Um, and even though that 5 log reduction is going to be delivered at a facility somewhere else, I still have to now go to that facility to say, I know that this pressure and this hold time will give me that 5 log reduction. If you happen to find a facility that either has already done the studies on
Right.
a product and has and says to you, you know what, we've already paid for this, you don't need to do it, we can use this study and reference it. That's really a discussion to be had with that facility. A lot of times, though, because I would say on average a study costs usually starting around $6,000, tolling facilities don't necessarily want to put up that kind of
Of course.
money. But also then that responsibility now falls on them.
Hmm.
So if there was ever a recall for some reason, as the inspector starts to work backwards, if you were the company that said, I own the study, I'm responsible for it, then that puts that
Right.
now the responsibility is in your hands as to why there was still
I could definitely see that a facility would want to say, look, we're just letting you rent the equipment or use the
essentially.
equipment, but
Yeah.
it's all up to you to make sure everything's safe that,
Right. And that's pretty much the way that it is. And so then from the tolling facility, they're not off the hook in terms of juice HACCP because they are still applying a treatment. So the inspector is supposed to be asking that facility, well, what information were you given
hmm
to know to run that treatment? And then that's when they would say, well, here's a copy of their HACCP plan, here's a copy of their validation study. This is our HACCP plan for our facility, right? Because a HACCP plan is all based off of a
of
process.
course.
So for sure, that tolling facility has to have their own plan in place to say, this is how we operate our business.
Hmm. Interesting. So, um, yeah, you have to get the studies. And so $6,000 for a study. And right now that has to be done per recipe.
So the answer to that would be yes, if you took the regulations like the way that they're kind of written as is. But the inspectors are willing to accept a rationale. So if you were able to explain in the summary of your study why you chose like one of your recipes to kind of cover all of your recipes, they're willing to accept that. One of the more recent things that I've seen, iFish kind of encouraging people to do is, let's say I make 10 recipes and I evaluate all of them based off of their ingredients and their pH, their water activity, their bricks, and maybe like, the acidity of it, like, so the titratable acidity. And let's say I pick the worst case scenario based off of, well, it's a green juice that is coming from like, vegetables that are touching the dirt, like the dirtiest products,
Hmm.
basically. The pH is also like right on the cusp of 4.6 kind of thing. So I feel like, that's my worst case scenario product. That's fine. But what they're also recommending is, let's say you create a matrix where you line up all the recipes, across the x-axis, and then the y-axis you put all the ingredients, and you kind of create like a checkbox, and then you do a percentage of each of those ingredients, kind of coming to an average, and then you almost create like a model recipe to include all
Right.
of the ingredients. So it's not something you would ever sell, obviously, like, because the combination could be super weird,
Hmm.
but it basically includes every single thing that you use in your facility, and you kind of create, again, sort of that worst case scenario product in terms of let's say the dirtiest ingredients. And you also create it so that it has maybe even a pH above 4.6, right? Because it's just a theoretical recipe.
Hmm.
So maybe you create the pH to be 5, right? And you create like a really high bricks, because bricks also influences a validation study and stuff. So again, like, if you kind of showcase out of our actual recipes, here's when we determined our worst case. Then out of a model one we created, this is what it looks like. And these are the results for both. So yes, that does add cost. And not everybody can afford to now chip in $12,000. So if you have to start somewhere, try and at least start with the rationale of your own recipes. And as you know, if that's fine and your inspector accepts it, that's great. If you get some pushback and they feel like this isn't enough, I need you to demonstrate more, then you could say, well, you know what? Okay, we can invest in one more study, and this is the approach that we want to take. And what I would encourage people to do is actually like reach out to the FDA at iFish before you spend the money
Mm,
and say, can you review what I've currently done and what I would like to do? And tell me if you think this is the right path. And they will give you advice. And that's kind of, I think, an area that a lot of people don't think is available to them. And that's one of the things that, we've started to do with the Cold Pressure Council is just be that conduit for when people come to us and say, like, where should I go for a validation study? How should I design it, kind of thing. We can sort of, help them, talk to the appropriate people to determine, like, what's the best practice for this study. Because nobody wants to waste money at the end of the
yeah,
day.
totally. It is surprising actually how rarely a lot of our customers will reach out proactively to the health department or the FDA before they start their business, you know?
They're probably nervous,
Yeah,
right?
and I think they just assume that and health inspectors just come in and shut you down if you're not up to standards, and it's up to you to know what they are and what they're not, you know? But what we've seen is they are generally pretty open to just giving you advice and taking a look at what you're planning and telling you,
Yep.
yes, this will be acceptable, no, this won't, and you know.
Yep. And if you like, yeah, absolutely. My you know, best advice would always be to demonstrate to your inspector before they get there that you know your risks and you know your best practices. And so you're showing them like this is the approach that you've taken. You don't want them to come in and they be asking you questions and you all you can say is, I don't know, I'm not sure. I'll have to look into it. Like then that's going to make them not feel very confident
Mm,
that in the way that you're operating, right? And
mhm.
especially with something like FSMA coming into place, the FDA inspectors are, getting a little bit more stricter with wanting to make sure that a food manufacturer is truly kind of like an expert in their area. Do they really understand how to manufacture that product, like with the best
Right.
safety approach to it? It's not really even enough anymore to, let's say, just have a validation study. Do you understand all the upstream, parameters that go involved into making this product? Because if you didn't have that type of 5 log reduction, are you doing everything you
Right.
possibly can, like not buying fruit that's fallen on the floor, right?
Mhm.
Are you getting the best quality produce and that kind of thing? All of those little details make your inspector realize that you are more professional at the product that you're making.
Right. Um, so if we were to come up, you know, because Good Nature has thousands of customers, or they're just these little local juice companies, right? A
Mhm.
lot of them are one location, some are two or three. In the U.S., there's probably at least 500 of them. Um, what are some important steps you think that someone selling raw juice could take to make sure that's being manufactured in a safe way, so that even if there were a chance of contamination, that they were eliminating that?
So um, the nice thing about like actually taking a juice HACCP course is that that instructor should be going over, all of the types of ingredients and where the risks are associated. So like the work that the juice task force is doing, we're trying to lay out that platform for the inspectors. But at the same time, the goal would be to have it incorporated also as a part of juice HACCP, which again just sort of goes back to the beginning that the manufacturer themselves understand what ingredients have higher risk factors. So since we're not there yet, we don't have that,
Right.
formalized. I personally think it's within every juice manufacturer's best interest to kind of understand their internal risk assessment of their ingredients, of their facility, their employees, like the environment, everything. So an in-person course is definitely much more beneficial that way than say doing something online. But again, I know that takes time. I know that takes money. It's not necessarily something that everybody wants, but having, like, similar to what we're doing with the Cold Pressure Council, where there's a resource, creating something like the Juice
Makers
Juice
Association.
Makers Association
Mhm.
as a resource for people to go to, just for people to even talk and say, well, like, I make this product and I ran into this problem. I had, a huge problem with this particular organism, and this is what it took to get that organism taken care of. Like, just even
I see what you're
having that
saying.
type of
Yeah.
dialogue and contact, I think, is hugely important to start to build awareness, because it's nature, it's natural. Don't think of it like, by you talking about it, that it's an embarrassment or there's shame on you for having that problem in house. Like, that's just the way that food manufacturing works. Is it's better to talk about it and say to someone, like, I need help with this. How do I get it out? I think it's worse if you're trying to hide it. And so that's kind of like going back to with the inspectors. If you demonstrate to the inspectors, like, before we went into this, we knew that we want to use these ingredients, and we know that these are the, pathogens or the bacteria that are most common with it.
And I took an in-person course.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. Yeah. To be able to say, like, I want to make a safe product. I'm not, Mickey Mousing around with this kind of thing. So
Mhm.
I think that would help people a lot.
So Cornell offers a course, right?
Cornell offers an in-person course. I'm not sure if there's too many other places, like
Yeah, I don't think so.
institutions.
That specialize in the juice
Yeah.
specifically. Yeah.
And Cornell is great too, because they also have a close association with the FDA. They helped write the original juice HACCP. So, and they also do a lot of other research in non-thermal areas. So not just HPP, but they do a lot of research with UV. So, even if you wanted to look at some other alternatives, it doesn't
Right.
just have to be pasteurization or HPP.
hmm Yeah, because I've been trying to formulate this, kind of idea lately about how the laws, juice is a little bit overregulated, saying you can't wholesale raw juice at all because there are thousands of people, myself included, that prefer to drink raw juice because we believe in the health benefits of it.
Mhm.
Whether or not we've actually seen any scientific data to back that up, we just believe that. And it's kind of sucks that I can't just go to the local coffee shop and buy a juice that was made by the juice company a couple blocks away,
Right.
and they would happily carry that juice, except they can't because it's against the law.
Mhm.
They treat it like it's this poisonous, toxic thing, which it could be if it's made with unsafe safety
Sure.
practices.
Yep.
So we're trying to come up with kind of a way that we can pitch the FDA eventually on what could a safe practice look like of making raw juice and wholesaling it in a limited area, maybe in your local town or city or something, so that the yoga studios, the gyms, the cafes can sell the local juice,
Yeah.
And something I've been talking to my friend Aaron about, he owns a little juice company in Las Vegas. He actually opened his company without realizing he couldn't wholesale until after they were open. So it was a big shock to him, He didn't talk to the right people. And there's tons. I mean, Robin, how often do you hear of that happening?
It happens quite a bit, actually. Just talking to people who are opening up their juice bars and getting ready, and just like, oh yeah, and it's gonna be great. So and so already, agreed to sell my juice, and like, talk to the health department yet? And they're like, no, but everybody's gonna love my juice. It's great.
Yeah.
But yeah, it happens quite a bit.
Yeah, it's really sad,
It is.
that
It's frustrating.
so excited to be making this juice and selling it in their community, and then they find out they can't. So what the idea Aaron came up with is maybe just within the local health department jurisdiction, so that your local health department knows where it's being made, that you're using safe practices, where it's being sold, distributed, but then it's not allowed to cross into another jurisdiction because that health department, that inspector doesn't know who you are, or that you're using safe practices and everything.
Yep.
Do you think that sounds reasonable?
So I think everything, like with regulatory bodies, they like facts, right? So they don't necessarily like theories and this kind of
Yeah,
thing.
right.
And So one of the areas when it came to low acid beverages that were going through HPP, at the beginning we were talking about things are very black and white. Either you're below 4.6 or you're above 4.6. And so if you're above 4.6, you're automatically a target for Clostridium botulinum. It's sort of like, okay, yep, you're a high risk product. Part of that comes from, even though that spore is not supposed to germinate under refrigeration, temperature abuse.
Right. If the person delivering it to the cafe is using
Yep.
a warm car on a warm day and it
Right.
sits for 2 hours out on the counter before someone puts it in the fridge. Yeah.
So what a lot of companies were doing it like on their own dime was doing studies that showed, okay, here's a temperature abuse study of my product where it's exposed to X temperatures over X days kind of thing. This is what grows, this is what doesn't grow kind of thing, right? And looking at it like that. So I would say that for a juice company, if they want to provide some concrete evidence to support that, look, if I ship it within an X amount of radius, it's safe. So how long does it take to cover that radius? How many hours, or like what does the distance look like? And then again, if you were to do a study and you could look at controlled temperature, abused temperature, and highly abused temperature, so something that's just left out at ambient
They're
condition,
totally
or
negligent.
left in a car that's heating
Right.
up, right? So you could kind of look at those worst case scenarios and then run, a gambit of the micro data to say, like, this is what grew and this is what didn't grow. And, we never had any issues. And you would definitely have to repeat that type of study at least 3 times to get some kind of statistical relevance. And just obviously, each time that you repeat it, you're making a fresh batch, because especially if you are a raw juice company, juice that you make on Monday is going to have a different bacteria combination going on in it than if you make the same recipe on Wednesday,
Of course.
right? So
Especially if you're getting a new delivery of produce. And
yes, because the way that a HACCP plan works is sort of like you've written in your HACCP plan to say, this is the best practice for my manufacturing. And if everything's good and you are not having any issues with recalls or anything like that, then that's evidence in itself. You've laid out a good best practice plan. Now, if something starts to go wrong and there's issues that come up and you get positives for organisms and stuff, then they're going to look at your plan and say, where's the problem? Like, where is it not best practices, and what is the area that we need to address and change? And so let's say it's your monitoring program, which is kind of similar to the example that I'm giving for the study. Basically, what you're doing is, with a study, you're sort of backing up that you're, like, the way that you're making your product and selling it is actually safe, right? Like, doing that study is kind of demonstrating that I'm giving you evidence that the way that I make and I ship my product is safe. And you might have to do it on an annual basis, and again, if you're not having any problems, you're not running into any issues, it should be fine. But if you start to run into problems, then they might say, well, you ran into a problem during these times of the year. Maybe you need to do a quarterly analysis, because depending on where you are, if you are in a region that has seasons, you're probably going to have different bacteria loads versus if you're in a region that it's the same sort of temperature.
Like a tropical region.
Yeah, all year long kind of thing. Even California is really more stable in terms of seasonality than versus like, up here in the Midwest or the East Coast, which go through 4 seasons, right? So I think that, like, you just kind of have to put the evidence to what you want or what you're claiming kind of thing. So it's not impossible, but I think what ultimately it comes down to, if we don't do anything and if we do nothing, then that's why things don't change.
Right.
So it's great that, like, there's insiders like myself that are kind of a voice and trying to help the juice people and help the industry. But at the same time, they also have to help themselves. And so the more evidence that they can collect, and then if collaboratively you can come together through JMA, then, that's going to help bring more evidence to the table for the FDA to get things to actually change.
Right. One thing I would worry about is like we had the romaine recall last year, a couple of them, I think, for E. coli. How do you, if you bring E. coli contaminated lettuce into your facility, can you clean that off? Is it possible?
It would be really hard to say that it's 100%. Actually, you probably couldn't, and that's kind of where something like a 5-log reduction comes in to
Right.
be useful, right? So, for instance, if I was a juice company that made a product as where romaine was an ingredient, but I have a validation study that shows I get a 5-log reduction, I don't need to recall my product that had
Right.
romaine in it.
Yeah.
But so
So, I mean, say theoretically years from now, juice companies are allowed to wholesale in their local area, but then they use bad romaine in the juice, and there is a breakout. Some people get sick. Um, is there any recourse to say, well, look, you know, it's the lettuce distributor's fault and not our fault for shipping this juice like this, or does it fall back on the juice company?
Well, it would still fall back on the juice company, even if it was determined not to be their fault, only just because the fact is if the ingredient was in the product, it just leaves risk that now the contamination is in the product. So regardless of where it came from and whose fault it was, if it's made its way to a product that hasn't had some kind of kill step, it's definitely that it's their responsibility to take it back and deal with it.
Right, for the recall and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then, there are a lot of, they literally pulled all the mixed salads and stuff off the
Right.
shelves in grocery stores, and that was part of the recall. But the government didn't come out and outlaw salad, you
Right.
know? So it seems like they're a little bit harder on juice than they are on other raw foods.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of it does come down to politics, right?
Mhm.
And so at the end of the day, could they ever really outlaw salad? And what are their alternatives? Like, what could they do? Could they enforce a new sanitation protocol, new sanitizers to be used? Possibly they could do that,
Mhm.
but they're really kind of limited as to
Yeah, because if you outlawed salad, people would, throw a fit. Like,
and you can't force them to cook the lettuce.
right, exactly.
Right. So there's research people have looked at using ozone, like for fresh produce, because you can't use HPP because it wilts it, right?
Right.
So what kind of technologies could you use? But then it always kind of comes down to the question of what's the consumer perception of that. Even if we demonstrate that it's safe, look at irradiation. Like irradiation doesn't have any detrimental effects for people, but it just has such a terrible connotation associated with it, right? Like people think of irradiation and they think of mutated,
Right.
foods and vegetables and stuff, but it's really no different almost than using your microwave at home. So
Oh, really?
it doesn't, make it unsafe for consumption to have irradiated foods.
Wow. Yeah, that does sound scary.
But it doesn't sound
Scary.
nice, does it?
Yeah.
Right? To think about that.
Irradiated. Yeah,
Yeah.
that would
No,
Yeah.
rub me the wrong
Yeah.
way.
I don't use a microwave, so I
Yeah.
wouldn't.
I don't use a microwave either, but at the same time, we probably eat irradiated spices all the time and we just don't know it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So that is an accepted method?
Certain ways that it's processed, it will have to say that it went through an irradiation treatment to it. But from a formulator standpoint, if I make a product using irradiated spices, I don't have to put that on my label.
Oh, man.
Back to this again.
Yeah, you just the labeling, It's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. And in the restaurants, right? I mean, think of how
Right.
many, restaurant chains probably use irradiated spices and you
Right.
wouldn't know the difference.
That's true too.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So another thing Cold Pressure Council is doing is kind of, well, I guess one thing, you're getting the word out there about HPP a little bit more. There are some companies that have done a really good job at marketing the fact they use HPP, talking about what it is, like Evolution Fresh.
Yep.
Then there's some other companies, like one of their big competitors, that is almost trying to hide the fact that it's HPP. like there are a couple companies in the beginning labeling the juices raw, and then they stopped doing that. And then still, some of them aren't putting high pressure processing on the label.
Right.
I feel like that's a little bit of an issue, and we've talked about this. Like,
hmm
there needs to be some kind of standard way that processes are labeled on foods,
Mhm.
not just like the nutritional ingredients, right?
Yep. I agree. Like, I personally, like, I guess because, being a scientist, like the way we know for ready to eat foods and beverages, they all go through some kind of process, whether that's the actual juicing equipment or chopping.
Yeah, there's at least one
Like,
step.
exactly. Like there's some kind of process. And so
Mhm.
like, I don't think that the machinery or the technology is the enemy, and it shouldn't be looked so negatively, right? Like, I think it's more about like what are the negative impacts that some either technology or preservatives like can have, right? And so as long as a company is just kind of open and honest and talking about what they're doing, and that's part of, what the council has in mind, like we're proud of HPP technology, and we feel that other people should be as well, because we know that the companies that are using it with good intentions. They're not using it to try and hide something. They're not trying to hide like the way that you hide a processing aid, and what we were just discussing with irradiated spices, like
Mhm.
certain things you don't have to put on your label. Well, you don't have to put that you HPP your product on your label, but why wouldn't you want to talk to your
Right.
consumer that you're spending millions of dollars to create a more either nutritious product for them, or a clean label, or low sodium or preservative free? Like, why wouldn't you want to talk about that?
Mhm. Well, I think the reason they don't is because some companies are trying to market it as raw juice,
Mm-hmm.
and at least the common belief is that if it's HPP, it's not raw.
Right.
So they'll hide it, or like in my opinion, using the term cold pressure is a little bit confusing instead of
Mhm.
just saying high pressure,
Mhm.
because lots of regular consumers see that and think that it says cold pressed because
Mhm.
it's so similar.
Mm-hmm.
So they're still not totally aware that there's a second processing step there.
For sure, for
Mhm.
sure. Well, and I think even just the first initial processing step, like consumers don't even really understand how their juice is made,
Right.
right? Like there's so many different ways that you can, like get juice out of a piece of
Right.
fruit. It's not just a cold press method, right? Like we've
Mhm.
talked about other different types of
Or even
technologies.
take it a step further, even like using enzymes to break the fruit down
Yeah,
and add in
exactly.
this enzyme slurry back into the
Yep.
juice. So it's not even really juice.
Not
It's
even
like,
really juice
yeah.
anymore. Yeah, it's some kind of concoction but yet from a regulatory perspective, it's still being able to be labeled as 100% juice, because technically you did use 100% of the fruit, right?
Yeah.
So it's such a muddy area, and the consumer definitely doesn't understand enough behind it and stuff. And so to your original point was just if manufacturers can be more open and honest about the way that they make a product, from start to finish, I
Mhm.
think is where we're moving towards
I agree.
with consumers. Because once upon a time, it was all about like, just people reading the ingredient deck kind of
Mhm.
thing. And now that's almost not enough anymore. They want to understand a little bit more, because now they've become aware of things like processing aids and things that don't have to go on the label. And it's like, well, why do you want to hide it from me? Just talk to me about it. Tell me
Right.
about it. Tell me what you're doing.
Yeah. If it's not bad, then why don't you tell me about it?
Yeah, just tell me about it.
And that's the thing. It's like if they're hiding it, I think that's what causes people to lose trust in food and
Yeah.
beverage in general.
Yeah.
Then even the companies that are doing it the right way aren't getting any credit.
Absolutely.
Because people can't believe anything on labeling. Like
Right.
that's where I'm at now.
Yep.
I don't trust anything on the grocery shelf anymore.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the only thing I trust is stuff I make at home.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is very sad and unfortunate, because then as a manufacturer, like people are very skeptical of you. And like I know with Good Foods, the company that I work with, I mean, really, like, their philosophy from the beginning has been, well, the way that we make it in the kitchen is kind of what we put into our products. And
Mhm.
so our production facility really is just using equipment in order to either, chop, dice, and blend and mix and this kind of thing. But it's not like we use processing aids there. And, we're not, using the technology to like create some kind of monster food and we're hiding it from them.
Right.
It's just we're using more large scale equipment to do it on a higher pace, right? A
Mhm.
faster pace, because you can't have employees do everything. That's just too cost prohibitive, right? So definitely you need manufacturing equipment to do certain things in the food production facilities. But at the same time, like now when you start to use things that, you know, not change the process, but, give you sort of a leg up and you don't have to disclose that leg up, then that's where it makes people, distrust like what is happening in every food manufacturing plant. Like there's no way. And and it's so funny because we definitely have heard lots of times where people are like, well, there's no way that I could taste this good without some kind of flavor ingredient and stuff like that.
Right.
And we're just kind of like, well, with flavors that you can't hide, like you have to put that on the label kind of thing. And even like in terms of even packaging, people are so skeptical sometimes. Like they'll look at it and be like, there's no way this is 12 ounces.
Oh,
It
right.
doesn't look like it's 12 ounces, right? Like, they're just, and even though you have it on your bottle and you're like, I can't lie about the volume that's
really.
in there. But we've just really become a skeptical society. And I think that's because there have been companies who have left a really bad taste in people's mouth. No pun intended.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's crazy that the first processed food, I think it was M&M's, like in the 20s or 30s.
Mhm.
So it's only been around for like 80, 85 years, processed food. So we've gone from, like, my grandmother lived in a time when there were no packaged, mass-produced foods,
Yeah.
They had their little local markets, but all that stuff was from the area.
Yeah.
And then since she was a child till now, we've gone through getting completely obsessed with mass-produced, heavily processed, just like engineered, everything. And now it seems like people are starting to push back and being
Yeah.
like, whoa, you guys got to slow down a little bit,
Yeah.
Like, currently, legally, we have a right to know the nutritional content
Mhm.
and the ingredients. And I feel like the next big step is process.
Yeah. Yeah. But and the interesting thing is though, like that's not necessarily all food and beverage across the category. Look at alcohol. Like they don't have to disclose
That's a good point.
everything on their label,
Yeah,
right?
which is strange.
You're still ingesting it.
Yeah.
Right? Why don't you have a right to know what's going
That
in
is
that?
interesting, yeah.
I find that so like confusing.
Yeah, especially some that do, like distilled alcohols and stuff probably don't have as much additives as beer and wine, right?
Yeah, probably not. I
I'm just
mean,
assuming. I actually don't know.
and in most cases, like with wine, they typically will say that there's added sulfites.
Right.
Like there's usually always naturally occurring sulfites
Mhm.
with grapes, but sometimes they usually add more in order to achieve the color and stabilization and that kind of thing. So
I
they,
know that a lot of beer manufacturers add in caramel color,
Mhm.
and that's been studied and shown to actually be really not good for you
Right.
at all to ingest. So it's amazing that they don't even have to put that on there.
yeah,
And I've heard some cheap wines are barely even any grape juice in them. It's like all just additives and colors and water and like,
Right. Well, and that kind of brings us, to the topic that we had discussed before with standards of
Right.
identity.
Mhm.
And they definitely were created by the government for a need. Once upon a time, you had companies calling their product maple syrup when it was like 95% corn syrup and like 5%
Right.
maple syrup. So there definitely has been a need for standard of identities to be able to say exactly what the product is. But as we know, then the food companies kind of get their hands on it and manipulate things for the best benefit to their interest.
Right.
And so they get their lawyers
As
involved.
soon as a term becomes a marketable thing,
Mhm.
then that's when,
It gets exploited.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like what's a good example? So standard of identity, you mentioned the orange juice, right?
Yeah. So orange juice has 12 standards of identity. And, we're probably familiar with some of the ones like, from concentrate, not from concentrate, previously frozen. So you have all of those, but a straight up like pressed orange juice doesn't exist under that category of
Just
12.
regular raw orange
Regular
juice, yeah.
raw orange juice, like that isn't really identified, which is kind of
So it
crazy
doesn't exist to the government.
from a regulatory perspective.
Right.
Yeah. Like, I mean, so it's kind of crazy when you think about it from that perspective. It doesn't have like an ID stamp, basically. And that all comes down to, because of labeling laws. So there's a necessity behind it and good intentions, I guess, behind it, but then things can be exploited,
Right.
right? That's where the
Yeah,
problem
and it
becomes.
seems like sometimes, like I know with the organic certification, I've been reading lately that some of the big food and beverages have been slowly getting their hands into the federal government for that and kind of relaxing it a little bit and using different ways that they consider organic when it's really not,
Yeah.
It seems like everything eventually, once the money starts going into lobbying and into the government, it's like things just start to change.
And that's a really good subject because like like it is sad that the term organic or the label of organic on a food product is losing credibility and
Right.
value. And that is disheartening to think that this has even happened to this side of the industry. Whereas if you look at one of the statistics, they'll tell you that non-GMO is more important to people than organic labeling.
Mm,
I heard that too.
And it's just because of the consumer faith and trust in it. People aren't trusting USDA organic anymore. They're trusting more like Organ Tilth organic, right? Instead of
right.
USDA.
Yeah.
But how many people, unless you're really into the food scene and the food industry, even know that? So probably most consumers just feel like, USDA organic is the most familiar to them. However, I'm hearing rumors that I shouldn't be trusting them. So should I spend the extra money and buy
Now,
this or
now,
not?
anytime they see the word organic, they're probably like, I don't know if I trust
I don't
this,
know if I
right?
trust it.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's worth the extra money.
Yeah, that's the problem. So, if JMA wanted to try to come up with some standard of identities for juice, for example, what does cold press mean? How does one go about doing that?
Yeah, I think that that's a great thing. Like, it's I would say that you probably should almost hard to say, like, I mean, do you start with like, laying out all the terms and putting it out there for the consumers to really build the education and the awareness there? Or do you kind of reach out to like the FDA, the regulatory side of it, and get their feedback and their input? Because the one thing that just comes to mind automatically thinking about it going with the FDA first is what we know that it's taken to get certain like phrase or certain connotations
Mhm.
associated with things. So the definition of fresh, the definition of natural, right? We know how long that took in the
Right.
courts to get those things. So most likely then if you go to them with terms like raw and cold pressed, I mean, it's going to be expensive and it's going to be years before you actually get some kind of definitive answer on that, especially because who are you going to be going up against and
I
what
know.
kind of
Well, that's the
pushback
thing. I
Yeah.
think like maybe it's not even worth it,
from a regulatory standpoint?
But what we can do in the beginning is get all members of the JMA to agree to use the same terms, right?
Absolutely. That's very powerful.
Yeah. So then if we have hundreds or thousands of companies all agreeing to use the same terms, then it
Yes.
will mean something, at least to the members of the association.
Right.
Then if consumers see the certified seal on
Yep.
the juice, they'll know, okay, this term means this term means
Yes.
that,
Yep. That's exactly how we felt with the high pressure certified mark that the council came up with, is that from an industry perspective, what the consumer doesn't need to see on it is that the industry is required to follow the set of guidelines and standards for best practices, best
Mm,
food safety practices for using HPP technology. And then from the consumer side of it, when they see that little bug, what is it telling them about the technology and the benefits to their food and stuff, right? That's really what they want to know. But to the industry, it means so much more. It's the first mark that is based off of like food safety practices and approaches, right? Like there's
mm.
not another mark out there that is requiring people to do that.
Interesting. Are labels required to put pasteurized on if it is?
I don't think you're required to put pasteurized,
But they
but
choose
they
to.
choose
Right.
to, and that's why you'll see a variety of different phrases like gently pasteurized,
pasteurized.
flash
Mhm.
pasteurized, lightly pasteurized. Like it's not like there's a
I
specific
know the
one.
same with HPP. You'll see high pressure process, high pressure pascalized, or
Yeah.
whatever they say, or
Yep.
cold pressured, or Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
A
the
bunch
only
of
one
different
that's an oxymoron is the people who call it high pressure pasteurized because it's like, well,
right.
pasteurized has a very specific, you're just
That one I
blending
never
the two.
understood. I'm like,
Yeah,
why would they want to do
yeah,
that?
I know.
That's just an
Yeah,
education thing, though,
it's an
right?
education thing,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of from the industry, they looked at it more like consumers know, or a lot of consumers know what pasteurization is. We're just showing them that this is like using
Mm,
pressure to pasteurize. And it's like, yeah, but that doesn't help because really, once the consumer discovers that, wait a minute, these two things don't mean the same, they mean something different. So why
right.
would you tell me that they're
And
one and the
then
same?
there's another trust
There's
issue,
another trust issue. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Or even companies calling the juice, literally calling it raw when it's been HPP'd
Yeah. Like,
or even pasteurized, I've seen.
yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
And that's another thing that I don't think a lot of people, like a lot of consumers, realize is that like a name that you call your product, and especially if you trademark that name, you could imply that it's either raw
Right.
or that it has some kind of
Like if
function.
raw's in the name of the brand, but you're not
Raw,
saying it's
not
raw.
even in the name of the brand, but just say like, I call this juice, raw gold. That's the name of this one. And I
Right.
trademark that.
Right.
I'm implying something
Yeah.
there, but I'm not going to get in trouble for it because it's now a name that I've trademarked.
Right.
And so a lot of people will use that approach. And I don't think the consumer realizes that they're not doing anything illegal when they do that.
Right. Yeah, it's not technically nothing's illegal until the FDA says this term means this, right?
Yeah. Or if a lawsuit comes to place to say like, what you were implying was misleading me. Right.
Right.
So like to your
They do
point,
like a class action.
a class action lawsuit. And so that, I think that doesn't necessarily help the industry either, because I think like that kind of just goes back to some people know that they can get away with like suing someone, they have the money for it and that kind
Yeah.
of thing. But what did it really do in the end? Did it change anything?
Mhm.
I mean, for us with the council, it definitely like made us aware that we want to make sure we use any terminology that's not misleading, not offending people, and that is literally like, we're not trying to hide the technology, we're trying to bring awareness. So we switched gears. Instead of calling it cold pressure certified or something, and went with high pressure certified, because I just think that then it sort of backs off from that confusion between the connotation of cold pressed.
Mhm.
And I remember like one time I even went into a store that they sold their cold pressed juice in their own retail chains, but it all went through high pressure. It all went through HPP, and on the back of their label it said like HPP, and it had some little phrase and it had an asterisk beside it, and then like on the counter of like where the juice case was, it explained, high pressure processing is a method of cold pressing or something like that. And I was
Yeah,
just kind
that's
of
what I'm
like,
talking about.
so to your point, what you want to create with the JMA is you want to create standards, right?
Right.
Like you want to create everybody speaking the same language. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with the council as well, is that everybody's on the same page with understanding food safety risks and understanding the technology's applications and limitations, because
Mhm.
it's not a silver bullet, so it's not a method of sterilization. And we're just trying to clear up, I guess, misconceptions, misunderstandings. And that's kind of what you guys want to work towards
Yeah,
too.
I think so. I think there's been an issue of trust in the juice industry. Um, ever since some companies started using confusing terminology and things, and I think it's turned a lot of people off, and they don't understand why some juice is $3 and some is $10. Because they're both using the same words and the same label and everything. So it's caused a lot of mistrust,
Yep.
which has really, really hurt the industry.
Yep.
Um,
Well, and I think also from an ingredient standpoint, the consumer doesn't understand, like, I'm sure you've seen the same product that I've seen where they say, like, we use cold pressed juices, but then they pasteurize the finished product.
right.
Right. And that's really frustrating to a juice bar or anybody using HPP or UV or something like that, because So you might have used like cold pressing methods to extract your juice, but in your finished product, you've just basically kind of undone everything
Right.
that was the benefit of cold pressing in the first place.
Right.
But to the consumer, because they are just kind of looking for that trendy word, cold
Just the little
pressed.
cues. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's kind of exploiting it.
The worst I ever saw was said made with raw ingredients, and it was heat pasteurized.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, the ingredients were raw.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Man,
Yeah.
that's just like,
It's
They
very
always are, though. You know, you're not gonna cook your
that's what I mean.
vegetables
Like,
to
obviously,
get-
juice is made from raw ingredients. There's
but
nothing
people
to do with
just
it.
see raw, yeah,
Yeah.
and they're banking on that.
well, and the most obvious one is like the Tropicana commercials,
Mhm.
from fresh oranges. Well, of course
Mm.
they were fresh at one point in time,
Right. Yeah.
and so that's something like that consumers probably don't realize that again from regulation of use of the word fresh to be able to you are allowed to say from fresh, but you
Mm.
can't say fresh orange juice. That's when you get in trouble.
Wow.
So just by putting one word in front of it, you're
Yeah.
allowed to say that now.
Mm.
Hmm.
And that's stuff from concentrate.
Well,
Or-
so like anything, if you're just using language around the word fresh, right? So if I want to be able to kind of what you were saying about the raw ingredients,
Mhm.
instead of saying like, made from raw carrots, like if I want to say made from fresh oranges, and then if I still want to pasteurize it, HPP, UV, whatever. But if I want to say it's a fresh orange juice,
That's what I
that
watch.
product can have no treatment done to it and can only have a maximum of a 17-day shelf life. And that's not just for orange juice. That's anything that wants to call that product fresh, right? Like, so it could be food as well. If I'm calling it's a fresh salad that's in the to-go section, it can't be on that shelf longer than 17 days if that's what the label says on it.
But could they just artificially put a shorter shelf life on it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Oh, for sure. For sure. But just 17 days was the magic number that was come up with.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for,
interesting.
for the word fresh.
Mm. So you're super involved in all kinds of like regulation and dealing with the health department and everything.
Mhm.
Do you know about anything that's coming up with CBD and how that's going with beverages?
Well, beverages seem to be the sort of easy point of entry. You definitely see not a lot of people making food products with CBD unless it's like some kind of bar or chocolate or something. But even then, those are kind of only sold in certain states. But from if they're looking to distribute outside of the state, it seems to be that beverages kind of have this easy entry point compared to food products. So you're definitely seeing a lot of companies sort of dip their toe into it and test the waters and stuff like that. And one of the things, right now, what everyone is doing is at least putting hemp derived
Mhm.
CBD to kind of, cover their butts in that respect. But you do have a lot of like big organizations working together to kind of move the regulations along faster. But I think we will get there. It's just a matter of money. Typically, is kind of what it comes down to. What I think will be interesting to see, is there's still such very little research and data. And we were talking about with HPP and how it's hard to kind of like, demonstrate the efficacy of the technology for different types of categories because there's so many variables that could impact the end
Right.
result. And with a compound like CBD, I mean, there can be, over 400 different types of cannabinoid molecules in like the vial. It depends if it's a broad spectrum versus like some of these other products, which are, which I think is a good thing. Like, there's got to be different options for everything. So rather than it being isolated from the plant, you have people producing CBD oil from a fermenter, right? And so then they're producing very specific cannabinoid compounds. And that's going to be really important if we are going to start to use CBD like in a medical perspective, right? For a dosage. Because as a doctor, you have to be able to say, take this amount, of this product kind of thing. right now, if you pick up a little vial of CBD that's like a broad spectrum, it will say like a suggested amount,
Right.
1 to
One
2
drop,
mLs or
or whatever.
something
Yeah.
like that kind of thing, right?
hmm
So I think we definitely need both. And it's just such an open area in terms of research. So selfishly, like for someone who loves HPP technology and loves what it's done for benefiting nutrients and flavors and this kind of thing, I'm really excited to see if there's any type of benefits or efficacy to like a product that has CBD in it having better like absorption or bioavailability or
Right.
use. Because just in discussions that I've had with some of the research scientists, they will tell you that the molecule is like it is altered by heat. Like there is like a negative association when it is treated by heat.
Mm.
So then in theory, one would think, well, if I put my my CBD beverage through pasteurization, is that going to be detrimental to the actual efficacy of the dosage, right?
Right.
Versus if it's HPP, is it more stable? We don't know yet,
hmm
right? But I think it's just exciting to think that it's possible that
Right.
that there could be an enhanced product with
Yeah.
the HPP.
So with the Farm Bill that passed, CBD is technically legal under federal law now, right?
As long
But
as
not as a
I think it has to say hemp derived though.
okay.
It has to have less than 0.03% THC in it,
Okay.
in order to be considered hemp.
Okay.
Yep.
So I also don't think though it's yet been listed as a grass. It's generally regarded as safe
Mm-hmm.
for food. Do you know?
It's not approved
I think
yet,
you're right.
Yeah.
to be used as an ingredient in other foods.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that's why they can put in like hemp oil, but not actual CBD or
Mm-hmm.
something.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it will be interesting to see what happens with that. I mean, there's just so much money going into CBD right now.
Yeah.
And I know there's so many beverage companies just waiting to kind of see what happens before they launch a full national, you
Yeah.
know.
And I mean that again, like back to the discussion of like being able to trust companies. You walked Expo, and so I mean, how many times did you have people feed you a story like our product is better than this person,
Mhm.
and we do this, and that makes our product better, and
Right.
so like that's not good either for the
Yeah,
industry.
right.
Like
Totally.
you can't do that. You can't build that type of distrust in consumers because then
Yeah.
they're gonna just think like that's a really expensive vial. Do I want to spend that much money if I don't know what I'm getting?
hmm
So,
And then also I've been seeing some brands that have CBD in it when actually tested have much lower levels in their advertising, which is obviously going to be a problem, I guess, with any kind of supplement type product, right?
yeah. Well, and there again, it's sort of like not understanding and not knowing what the stability of that compound is,
Good point.
right? Like it does heat treatment affect it, does
Mm.
UV, does acidification. Like we don't know enough about it. Like when is it stable and when is it not stable?
Mhm.
Does it oxidize, right? Like does it change over time? Like we don't have enough research yet and data.
Right.
Still a
Who
lot
who
of
do you
work to
think
do.
should be responsible for doing the research?
Right now, when I've talked to the suppliers, they will say like you have to do your own research.
Mm.
If you want to use it in our product, you have to do it. And that's fine. I think that's great, for companies to take it in-house and do it themselves. My pushback has always been, okay, so tell me what lab to work with and tell me what questions I need to ask. Because
Right.
right now, like if I, call up the same lab that I work with for micro testing, the first thing they're going to ask me is, what do you want me to test? And I don't know what to tell them.
Right.
So what are you asking to when you test your product and
Mhm.
who do you work with, right? So there's just got to be better communication in the industry.
Cool. It'd be great to have someone like you help out with the JMA if you'd be willing to kind of help us navigate the whole forming an association and trying to develop some standards. And so how do you think you might be able to help with that?
Yeah, I mean, one, I would be happy to help because, as someone who's been a consultant, for 8 years, it doesn't make me feel good when people have come to me and said things like, if I didn't have you to turn to and ask these questions, I don't know where I'd go.
Mhm.
Like that just makes me kind of sad and scared for the industry kind of thing. Like I
Mhm.
shouldn't be the only person. And so that was, the motivation in wanting to form the council, just so the HPP industry had a resource. Same with the juice task force. Like, we realized as a juice manufacturing industry, we kind of needed to come together and sort of relook the juice HACCP that was implemented years ago,
Right.
right? Take a fresh look at it and see,
great.
like, let's have a new approach. So same thing from the Juice Association. It's sort of like, how can we all get on the same page where we all speak the same language and we're all sending the same message and it's the same type of education? Like, if companies want to pasteurize their juice, that's fine.
Yeah.
Like, that's totally
And there
up
are
to them.
reasons why some people would prefer to buy pasteurized juice. If they're
Absolutely.
worried that they want to make sure what they're giving their kid has been, 100%
Yep.
pasteurized and everything. So
And you know what? And sometimes it's a necessity. If you are sending your kid to school all day and
yeah, good point.
it's your kid, and even if you put that ice pack in there with them,
Right.
you have no idea if they're going to take it out and leave it on the
Mm.
lunch table or what they're going to do with it. Or what if you live in some remote part,
Right.
of the world and stuff, and like the best thing you can send up to them is something that's been pasteurized, right? Like, so there's a need for all different types of products. And from a personal perspective, I've never really looked at, HPP products in competition, like with some of these other thermal forms of treatment and stuff, because I've always just kind of looked at it like, these companies all make a decision based off of a business model, right?
Mhm.
And so even using a technology like HPP, it's got to make sense for your business model. It's got to make sense for your intentions and why you want to do it and stuff. So, but I think if people just are constantly hiding why they do it and why they've made the choices, that's when misconceptions come up. That's when people get confused and they start to distrust companies. If companies would just say, like, hey, you know what, this is the way we manufacture our product, and we do it like this, maybe it is to be affordable. Maybe it is to hit a certain price point, because that's another really important
Mhm.
factor. Not everybody can afford a $10 bottle of juice.
Right.
Are they any less deserving than having a juice? Sure, maybe it is fortified with the nutrients, but is it better than, I don't know, eating a bag of potato chips,
Right.
right? Or something like that. So I think
And
there's
then
a
that
need for
also,
everything.
and then that also helps educate people in knowing, okay, this product can be cheaper because they can make it large quantities, pasteurize it, store it and on the shelf, instead of in a refrigerator. And it's
Yeah.
like, okay, now at least that still gives some credibility back to the brands that are
Right.
selling it for $8 or $10,
Yeah. Exactly. And like, it is disheartening that the sort of cold pressed juice category, whether HPP or not, kind of went into this price competition, right?
Right.
And I get it. Like, $10 is expensive
Mhm.
for a single, serve bottle of juice. So it's not cheap. But instead of trying to, explain why it's so expensive and justify the cost, let's talk about why the other ones are less expensive, right? So, taking not such a competitive approach, like mine is better because of this and this
Mhm.
and that kind of thing. It's like, well, just here's the differences between the two.
Right.
You make the decision where you feel like, if you feel like, well, you know what, that's enough nutrition for me. I'm okay. I only want to spend $3.99 on this bottle, and I'm satisfied with the nutrition I'm going to get out of it.
Mhm.
That's their
For sure.
choice.
I mean, it's
right?
just like putting the nutrients on the label.
Yep.
People haven't stopped buying cake,
Right. Yeah.
It's like it just
Yeah.
lets them make the decision for themselves.
Yeah, totally. So I think, like, that's something that would be great for the Juice Manufacturers Association to kind of talk about the, like, the price point, and just like the fear that people kind of have that, well, if I don't find a way to make my juice more affordable, nobody's going to want to buy it. Well, you don't know that.
Right.
Maybe people will buy it, but if you just educate them to the difference, then let them make their
Yeah, and
their
there is a whole
decision.
resurgence of this craft beverage thing. It's going on in
Mhm.
beer and in juice. We're seeing the industry change and become a lot more little local companies
Yep.
instead of a few big ones,
Yep.
So it is definitely marketable if there are ways you can talk about it
Yep.
that set you apart other than just the same words that the big guys are using that
Right.
are pasteurizing,
Yep. Well, and I mean, even if you like take a page out of guacamole's playbook,
Mhm.
right? Similar to a green juice. prior to using HPP, the only way that you could, sort of get any type of avocado pulp-based product, whether that just be straight pulp or guacamole, was by freezing it.
Mm.
And anybody, who's ever frozen
Yeah.
avocado, it just doesn't taste the same.
Mhm.
So when HPP first started to be used for that product, there was so much pushback from the retail side of it. And their attitude was, no one is going to ever pay that much money for prepackaged
Oh,
guacamole.
interesting.
25 years later, how wrong were they?
Yeah.
Now, just like consumers can almost like either see or taste when they look at, a prepackaged guacamole that's been frozen, they're just kind of like, something's wrong with that. It doesn't taste right.
Mhm.
It's not the same. Why can't it be the same story for juice?
Right.
You just kind of have to persevere and really demonstrate that, this method that you're doing it or this recipe combination, it is superior and it deserves this price point.
Right.
I
Yeah.
think people do figure that out too. Consumers that don't really know anything about juice, they maybe start off drinking a 7-Eleven juice for $2.99 or whatever, and then they have something made it with a cold press process or
Mhm.
a fresh juice,
I
and
think,
they can tell the difference.
yeah, and I think it's good, like especially for within your organization, to really kind of hone in on, the market research part of it.
Right.
And so
I agree.
if part of, the funding, because it's expensive for every single company to have to get their spins or IRA data and
Right.
stuff, right? So, if part of being a member to the association was, having that data available to them, because things like, I've heard firsthand from some of my friends that drink, green juices, love it, will pay $10. But for their family, they only want to go to Costco and buy the $5 bottle of green juice.
Mm.
And they're just like, yes, I know it's, mainly apple juice with some greens in it, but it's good enough. I know that it's not heat treated.
Mhm.
If my kids don't drink it all and I end up throwing away part of
Mm.
it, I don't feel so bad. It only cost
Better
me
than
$5.
drinking soda,
Yeah,
you
for
know.
this big jug. So I think it's data like that is really important for people to understand, because somebody who like only drinks, say, 100% green juice for themselves would look at that product on the shelf and be like, I am not spending $5 on that. Like,
Right.
that's such a waste of money. And it's kind of like, is it really a waste of money? Look at the consumer and who's buying it and why they're buying it.
Mhm.
There's a reason, there's a need for it,
A
right?
lot of times, just the fact that it's better than giving them pasteurized juice is enough for them.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Or to your point, pop.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Giving them soda.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that would be a great part to the, find out what's important to your members.
Right.
Like, what are they missing? What are they looking for? I know this sounds crazy, but like, what would almost be like on their wish list? If I had the money to spend on this type of information or
Exactly.
knowledge.
And that's
No.
kind of how I want to pitch it when people join and pay their dues.
Yeah.
I'd like to offer them, where would you prefer the money get spent?
Yeah.
Is it consumer education? Is it research studies for yourself?
Yep.
Is it, getting that market data so that you can grow your business better?
Yep.
Is it lobbying the FDA to change the laws? So then you're having people kind of vote with their money,
Yep.
on what they want to see done.
Is it campaigns?
Right.
Like, is it consumer awareness campaigns? Do you go to
Mhm.
the retailer and say, like, we want to have an awareness day of juice and stuff like that? Like, do you get them on board? Like, so I think, yeah, just kind of finding like, what's on their wish list.
We also thought of the idea of doing a documentary too.
Mhm.
Just going back to consumer education, seems like now a documentary is a really good way to do that.
I think a documentary would be amazing to like,
Mm.
show all the different ways of making juice, shelf life extension, the difference between preservatives versus like, mechanical processes
Right.
like pasteurization or HPP.
And then go into also documenting why the laws are the way they are,
Yeah.
what's happened in the past, how
Exactly.
it could be prevented in the future. It
Yep.
could be really cool.
And if you do that for the consumer, it could almost help the juice manufacturers feel more responsible to want to be a little bit more up on their game for their preventative measures. Because really,
Totally.
like, that's what FSMA is ultimately about, is really preventative measures.
Mhm.
getting better at even just preventing a crisis or an incident. And if you are a raw juice, you should be all about your preventative
Right.
measures because you don't have that, safety guard
Mhm.
at the end of it kind of thing.
Does the government use third parties to um, kind of inspect food facilities, or is it all done by the actual government? Like if the JMA were to say, "Look, we want to volunteer to be this uh, agency that will inspect juice companies to make sure they're following these guidelines."
So kind of like, if you are like SQF or BRC, right? So those are food safety accreditations
Mm,
that you can go after. You would probably want to fall into that realm, like
okay.
for juice manufacturing specifically.
Yep.
And that probably won't, take away from, unless you get qualified for GFSI, right? So that's what the companies who are getting SQF or are BRC certified, so they want to be GFSI, right? So Global Food Safety
Okay.
Initiative.
That's kind of like the highest standard.
Yeah. So like to be in Costco, you have to be GFSI, right?
Okay.
And so if the GMA would be able to demonstrate themselves for juice manufacturing, you're on par with an SQF or a BRC,
Mm,
then that would qualify for GFSI, right?
cool.
Like, but if not, like maybe you can even just start with like how do you get
Right.
SQF or BRC to recognize the work that you're
Mm,
doing specifically for juice manufacturing.
interesting. Yeah, because I think what we'd like to do is certify companies if they choose to go through the process,
Mm-hmm.
so they can put the certification seal on their bottle, and then that would not only certify that they're using safe manufacturing practices,
Yep.
but also consumers could scan the little QR code in the
Mm-hmm.
seal, and it would take you to a page on the JMA website that would walk you through all the processing steps used in the juice.
Yep.
So it'd be a super transparent way that consumers could trust the juice and be like, okay, it was made on a press and then it was HPP'd and then it
Right.
was bottled and that's it,
Yep.
or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it's pasteurized and hot filled or
Yep.
whatever it is, but at least then they have full transparency of the process.
I think that's definitely great for the consumers because, with not having to put on the label, is it HPP? Is it pasteurized?
Right.
I've definitely had some HPP companies contact me and say, like, well, we don't put a statement on our product, but yet we're getting people just assuming that we're
Mm,
pasteurizing it because of the shelf life. We don't want to put an HPP statement on there. So, what should we say to them? How should we respond?
mm,
And that kind of thing. But if there was something like that mark, I mean, that would alleviate all
right.
questions, right? And then from the regulatory side of things, like, you know, that's a great place to start. And that's kind of where we are at with the HPC logo for
Right.
the council, which is, you know, right now, the FDA, like, we want to be viewed as a resource for them to go to and kind of say, like, well, we've looked at the guidelines that you've set out kind of thing. And we know that the practices that you're giving companies advice on are sort of the best food safety practices when it comes to HPP. So, we want to work closely with you and stuff like that, and value the companies that are choosing to use your logo, or going down this path. The one piece of advice that I would give you is that it could get costly in terms of legal issues because there's nothing really stopping people from just taking your logo and
I know.
copying it and
Right.
putting it on. And we've already run into like a number of cases
Wow,
where
really?
we've had to send out letters to people to be like, you're not a member and you're not using the logo. Like you're
I
not.
know. I've thought about that too. It's
So
like you have to definitely have a budget for cease and desist letters.
yes, yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
So
that's crazy.
yeah. But at the same time, like, what do they say? Imitation is the best form of
Right.
flattery. So clearly people want
Yeah,
it.
something's working.
Something's working. Why isn't and so that's always our first approach is we don't go right to the lawyers. As the council will send them a letter to say, like, you're using the logo. We would love for you to use it appropriately, become
Right.
a member and go through this. And hopefully you sway them and get them to be on board that way.
Wow. That's crazy. So you are a consultant. If someone wanted to reach out to you for consulting services, is there a way they could do that?
Well, so right now I've actually kind of, stepped back from
Oh yeah,
doing
you're working for
consulting.
Good Foods.
Yeah, I'm working
Right.
with Good Foods, and then I'm also working on my side chickpea butter and stuff.
Right.
So
Well, tell
yeah.
us about that a little bit.
Well, it's actually such a, I mean, I find it a really interesting story. I don't know if the rest of the world would, but I was actually going through teachers college after I finished my master's, and my daughter was 2 years old at the time. So I wanted to be like a high school science teacher. I loved teaching, like just about science, and I've just always had a passion for food and nutrition. So when I was doing my school placements in Canada, we've had a no tree nut policy in our school systems for a long time because of an unfortunate incident. So we have this law called Megan's Law. So in the elementary schools, you can't bring any tree nut products. And in my head, I kind of thought, well, we're big nut butter eaters in our household. And what am I going to send my daughter to school with when she's 2? Not every kid likes ham and cheese, and not every family can afford meat sandwiches. And a jam sandwich is not very nutritious, right? So I made a lot of hummus and thought, could I make this like a sweet hummus and make it something for sandwiches? That was my first approach, and also my first introduction to HPP, because I didn't know anything about food safety or food production at the time. I just knew what I was making in my kitchen at home couldn't be, sold in stores. It needed some kind of food safety parameter. So I got introduced to the technology, went to the facility in Canada and ran some tests. And of course, it worked great because hummus works great through HPP. But, 8 years ago, 9 years ago almost now, chickpeas just did not have the same, popularity that they have now. Allergen awareness was not the same as it is now. So to find a nut-free facility to make it, like I was really just kind of spinning my wheels and trying to make this happen. But in the HPP world, they were also struggling from a regulatory standpoint, in particular in Canada, to get the technology approved, because what happened in Canada was HPP got thrown under novel foods regulation. And so basically what that means is that if I were to sell my hummus using HPP onto the Canadian market, I have to demonstrate to Health Canada that it's still fit for consumption. How do you do that? You have to petition the government and show them data for microbiology, toxicology, chemical, and nutrition.
Wow.
And it typically takes a year to get approved. Well, once it is approved, then it's approved to the public for that category. So as a food manufacturer, you'd be like, well, I'm going to spend all this money
And
and
then
resource
everyone
and
else is
time,
going to,
and everyone else can take advantage of it. So as the suppliers to the equipment, they were okay to pay the bill to have those studies done for high lucrative categories for them, so meat or guacamole or salsa or something like that. And because of my background, my academic background, they basically said, well, like, hey, well, you're sort of figuring out what you're doing with your chickpea butter. Could we hire you as a
Right.
consultant to write these petitions for Health Canada? So that's kind of how the ball got going. But I was really spinning my wheels with the chickpea butter. So I just kind of humbly put it to the back burner and thought, you know what, if it's meant to be, like, I'll revisit it. Fast forward to 2016, now knowing what I know about food manufacturing, the industry, huge change in the popularity of chickpeas, allergen awareness, this kind of thing. I looked at the product again and I thought, well, could I actually make this to be like an actual nut butter and make it shelf stable and not even use HPP? So I just reworked the recipe to create something that doesn't need the technology and is just as shelf stable as regular peanut butters and nut
cool.
butters and stuff. But I've spent like the last 2 years looking for a nut-free facility. Like, it is still
Really?
so difficult to find a nut-free co-packer. Luckily, I found a partner to work with, and so we're just getting up and going this year and hope to be having a product available like on Amazon later this year,
Wow,
and then in
great.
retail probably next year and stuff. So I'm excited,
Sounds
but
fun.
that's as you've probably worked with so many entrepreneurs over the years, like, it's not easy to be in the food industry game, and
Right.
you really have to kind of have passion behind
Yeah.
it. And especially for juice, like if there's one area that I've always said to people when they've, kind of come to me in the beginning and said like, I make the best juice and I'm going to be
Right.
better than this person and that person. Kind of always said to them, well, I hope you love juicing because if you don't, it'll break
I
you.
say the same
Yeah.
thing. Right? I say it to everybody. I
It's,
said
yeah,
I said if you're not super passionate about it, it won't work
it won't
because
work.
it's really tough. Really
Mhm.
tough industry, which is also why I love the people in the industry so much because they're all so passionate.
So passionate.
Like at JuiceCon, the energy there,
Yeah.
everyone was just so happy to be there, meeting each other, sharing information and educating
Yeah.
each other. It's just like a really great group of people.
Like if there was a list of like the toughest food manufacturing jobs in the industry, I think juice manufacturing
totally.
is
Probably
like
number one.
Yeah, it's on the top 5 for sure. Because
Yeah.
operating under cold conditions is not motivating for employees.
Right.
So as a manufacturer, and maybe that's also a part of the Juice Manufacturing Association. How do you motivate your employees,
Right.
as a company to want to stay in the game and not get tired of it? Because it definitely tests everything, your patience, like
Not only
yeah.
that, but then it's also in the CPG industry, which is super competitive, takes a lot of funding. There's a lot of really experienced people you're competing with, and it's
Absolutely.
like it's almost like the tech world, it's just
Yep.
a lot of startups, millions of dollars in funding and
And it's discouraging because when you're in it and then like, hey, my competitor is buying already pre-pasteurized juice and purees and then just taking them,
Right.
reblending
Yeah,
them,
exactly.
and then repasteurizing them again and killing it with the marketing. So here they're making this really cheap juice and they're making a good profit off of it because they've got awesome marketing skills.
Mhm.
And like that's really frustrating to a company.
Yeah, because a lot of the industry is just marketing. That's what it is. Just different ways you can market the same product,
Yeah.
and talk about it in different ways.
And that's how I feel even like with the chickpea butter, I one of the reasons why it did take me so long is because I use coconut oil in it. And even though technically that's not a nut, right now it's thrown on the nut allergy list by the
Mm.
FDA. But how many times do you actually ever have somebody who has an allergic reaction? So I do use a refined coconut oil, but the point is that I didn't want to use palm oil. And just because similar to beverages, there's just such a large negative impact on using palm oil to our planet. Even the companies that say, oh, it's a sustainable palm oil. Well, there's no such thing as a sustainable palm oil because even the sustainable industries feed into the unsustainable industry. So it's a vicious cycle. So to just get away from it altogether is really what we have to do. But we're so dependent on it, not just in food and cosmetics and everything. So for me, I was just kind of like, you know what? If I'm doing this, I'm all in. I'm all in on it being nut free. I'm all in on being like a wholesome product, like the minimalist
Mhm.
ingredients and being authentic and true. Like, so I do get, moms who will email me and say like, I just want to ask you, are you sure there's none of these products in your facility and this kind of stuff? And you need to answer those because, especially with something like allergies, we're not talking about someone who gets an upset stomach. We're talking about life or death, right? It's a very
Serious.
serious matter. So, like, of all the, products that I've ever worked on or developed for people, not just because it's my own, but I absolutely am the most transparent with it because of the here, this food safety isn't about bacteria, right? It's about an allergen, which is really severe.
Well, it sounds like quite the adventure you're on
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
So does it have a brand name, the chickpea butter?
Chixi, CHIXI.
Cool.
Yeah.
So we can look for that on Amazon later this year?
Yeah. Yeah. I'll let you know when it's going to be available.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Sounds fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I'm really happy to have you part of this conversation as we're gearing up. JMA, we're going to have JuiceCon coming up again. I think it's going to be a really important topic in the next few years in our industry.
Yep.
So thanks so much for, just being open-minded and helping and,
Yeah, absolutely.
coming to Buffalo. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So
I think if you invite more people to come in the summer,
yeah, that's true.
there's no problem. They
a
can go
good
to
point.
Niagara Falls and
I know.
it's gorgeous there.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Any
Well, thanks,
last
Charlie.
last words you want to get across to everybody, or?
No, I just think that like what you're doing is so important. The unifying the industry ultimately is definitely what I've realized having spent the last, almost 10 years with HPP is coming together as opposed to fighting one
Right.
another.
Totally.
That is just a headache and a nightmare.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Joyce.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin.
Yep. Thank you.
Probably.
Take care.